Hey everybody, it's Courtney, and today I am sharing a project for the Save the Crafty YouTuber hop. If you guys aren't familiar with this hop is full of very talented crafters as well as some pretty amazing sponsors. There's also many giveaways pretty much on every video, so be sure to leave comments on as many videos as you possibly can for a chance to win. All of the information will be linked in the description box below, as well as a link to the next video on the hop. So today I am going to be using the Gorgeous Vases stamp set by Pink and Main, which by the way is the giveaway on this channel. So you just need to leave a comment by April 5th and all winners will be announced on April 10th on Justine's YouTube channel and blog. So I am working on a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock here, and this is cut down to 5.5 by 3 3/4. So it's a little bit skinnier than a normal card panel. I treated that with my anti-static tool, and I'm just going to be using the little bouquets. I'm not using the vases in this card. So I'm stamping here one at a time with Versamark ink, and then I will remove my card panel and sprinkle on some silver embossing powder. Now, I'm not going to heat set this yet, but I did sprinkle on the embossing powder first before moving on to the next image, just so that I can actually see where I stamped. Obviously, the Versamark is clear, and it's a clear sticky ink, so it's sometimes hard to see, especially when you're working on white paper. So I'm going to take the next little arrangement of flowers here and line that up directly next to the first one and stamp that again with the Versamark ink. At this point, I am not worried about going directly over a portion of the image I've already stamped out and sprinkled on the embossing powder with. Once everything is heat set, you're never going to be able to tell the difference, and this way you don't have to worry about masking. The only thing you do want to make sure that you avoid is moving around your stamp too much. So when you're positioning the next image, you just want to make sure that you're not moving it around all that much, or else you're just going to scrape off the embossing powder you already put on there. You kind of just want to go with whatever placement you put down originally. That way everything kind of stays in place. So I am moving on to the last little image here, this last little bouquet for this lower corner. And I'm going to do the same thing once again, stamp that out with the Versamark ink, and then once again, sprinkle on that silver embossing powder. Now I have my heat gun heating up off to the side. I usually heat my heat gun up for about 30 seconds to 45 seconds, especially when I'm heating up a large panel like this, and this will minimize the warping. Now, I find that Bristol Smooth does warp a little bit more than regular cardstock, but this will kind of minimize it a little bit at least. Before I did heat set that, I took a craft knife just to kind of clean up some of those areas that did overlap. I did miss an area or two, but once everything is colored in, you'll never be able to tell the difference. So now that my heat gun is heated up, I can go ahead and heat set all of this embossing powder. And once I have all of that heat set, I do heat from behind just a little bit, and this will kind of even out the card panel a little bit as well. Yes, I did still have warping, but it was minimal. So for my images, I am going to bring out my Arteza Real Brush pens, and I'm only going to be using one color for each leaf and one color for each flower, and you can still get very soft, pretty results with just one color, so you don't need the big, huge pack to get really nice results. Now you can blend these with just themselves, so if you do use multiple colors, you can just use multiple colors and no water, but I am using water for this. All I'm going to do, and I'm starting off with these little tiny leaves here, is I'm just adding one little flick of color right there on the base of each of the leaves. Then I am going to take a damp paintbrush, not a wet paintbrush, just a damp one, and just going to let that spread out. Now, I'm not really worried about these little tiny leaves here because honestly, they're so tiny, and now that I embossed them, they're even tinier. So I don't really have a whole lot of space to work with to get a nice blend. Some of these larger leaves, which I'm going to switch over to a different green, I have a little bit more room to get more of a blend. So again, I'm just going to add a little bit of that color to the base of the leaf, go in with a damp paintbrush, and you can see that each time I clean off my paintbrush, I'm just lightly dabbing that off on a paper towel. I'm not wiping all the water off, but I'm dabbing it off so it's not dripping wet. Then I'll start at the tip of the leaf, so the opposite end where I actually put that color, get that area wet, and then move down to where I actually added that pigment and let it spread out on its own. Now, some of the larger areas are probably not going to spread out all the way to the tip, and I'm fine with that. This is kind of a springy card, so I want my colors to be more subtle and more pastel-y, if that's even a word. And sometimes it's hard to get more of a lighter or a more pastel look with real brush pens, whether it be the Arteza or the Zig, because they are such vibrant colors. But just adding a tiny bit of the pigment and then spreading that out with the water, it does kind of tone everything down and gives you a lighter, more subtle look. So I finished up all of the additional leaves with that same color, and then we're going to move on to the flowers. So for this first flower, I'm going to be using a yellow color here, and I'm going to pretty much do the same thing as I've done with the leaves. I'm just going to add a little bit of that pigment where the darkest areas will be, which is basically just on the base of each one of the petals and where one petal would be laying behind another. Then I'm going to bring out that paintbrush and I'm going to add that water directly to the tip of the petal and move my way down to the pigment. You'll see that I'm cleaning off my brush each and every time. If you don't clean off your brush each and every time, you already have a little bit of pigment on there, so you're not going to get even results. And most of the time with watercolor, it doesn't really matter if you have even results, but it is easier if you just quickly clean off your paintbrush in between. So I went ahead and used that same yellow for 2 additional flowers, and then I will move on to the next set of flowers, and I'm going to be bringing in a pink color for this one. And I am showing you just one of each flower here, mainly so that you can see what colors I used, but honestly, the blending and the watercoloring itself is pretty self-explanatory. For this little spirally looking flower, I just added a little bit of that pigment where, I guess, on the inside of the little spirally pieces, or the spirally petals, I guess you could say. But then I pretty much did the same thing, adding that water to the opposite end of where I had placed that pigment. There's a couple more of these flowers, so I did color those in the same way. And then we will move on to a purple color for the next flowers. And these are quite large flowers, and there's a lot of folds and a lot of basically where there would be shadows if I was doing real coloring here. So I am going to pay attention to them, but I'm not going to be stressing over where my shadows are, because the water is going to kind of make this spread out a little bit, and you're not really going to be able to tell. You have the embossed lines, so you don't have to worry about adding shadows exactly where they need to be added, because you have those embossed areas that are so prominent. Also, with watercolor, typically I wouldn't work with 2 petals directly next to one another, because where it's wet, it's going to blend in with the petal next to it. But being I did emboss these images or these petals are a little bit raised up from the paper. So it's kind of acting as a barrier so that I can work with all of the petals that are directly next to one another and not worry about them bleeding from one to the other. I have that little raised area that is preventing that from happening. So just finishing up these last 2 flowers here, and I'm bringing out an orange color, and again, just adding a little bit of shading to the base or towards the center of that flower and blending that out with the water. So once all of that was done, we are going to create a border for the top and bottom of this card panel. I'm taking a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and this is cut down to 5.5 by 4.25, and I'm just smushing on my Versamark ink on the top and bottom. This is going to be a landscape card, so it would be on the longer ends. Sprinkling on that same silver embossing powder on both of those ends. It does not have to look nice at all. It's looking a little messy, but trust me, you will not see all of this. Then I will heat set that. Now, when you're heat embossing a large area like this, it tends to look a little bumpy sometimes, because the first time around you don't necessarily get perfect coverage. And for a sentiment or even sometimes an image, it's hard to tell because it's not such a large area. It's more of a lined image. But in order to get rid of this bumpy look, I'm just going to do the same exact thing again. I'm going to smush on that ink pad here and then sprinkle on more of that silver embossing powder and heat set that again. And as you to heat set this the second time, and you can certainly do more than 2 layers, but I thought 2 layers was sufficient for this one, you'll see that your results are a lot more smooth, and it actually looks more like mirror cardstock rather than heat embossing. So once that was all done, I can go ahead and adhere this down to a white A2 size note card, and this is just going to basically be the mat for my main card panel. I prefer to use liquid glue because I feel like I have a couple of seconds to kind of work with it and move it around and make sure everything is lined up before it becomes permanent. So I adhered that down to my card base, and then we will add the sentiment to our main panel. I am using one of the sentiments from the same stamp set, and I did heat emboss this as well, just in the top center of the card panel, I guess you could say. Now you can see now that the paper is quite warped. Not only did I add a ton of heat to this, but I've also added water to it. So I do have a little bit of warping, so I did have to kind of play around with this sentiment to make sure it was lined up, at least to the eye. Once I close my MISTI door, I can use the grid lines on that MISTI door just to make sure that they are lined up with the sentiment and the sentiment is straight before actually stamping that on to my card panel. Be sure to treat this with your anti-static tool once again. Stamp that out with Versamark ink, sprinkled on even more of that silver embossing powder, and heat set that. Now you don't have to use silver embossing powder here. I just figured silver goes well with spring. I have done similar cards with gold embossing powder, and that looks really pretty as well. You can even use white embossing powder, especially if you wanted to create a background that will really make your flowers stand out as well. So once that's done, I'm going to add a little bit of fun foam to the back of this panel and stick that down directly over my heat embossed background there. I use the fun foam that has adhesive on one side. I just get this from Walmart. You can find it in the kids craft section, and it's fairly inexpensive. And then I will stick that down to my panel. Now, because of all the warping and the fact I'm using wet glue, it doesn't stick right away. I'm sticking it down with fun foam onto embossed areas. So I just placed my MISTI on top of this for a few minutes to make sure that this lays completely flat while it dries. Next, I added a little bit of shimmer to just the flowers with the Nuvo Aqua Shimmer Pen, and you do want to work fairly quickly here so that you don't spread out that color more than we already have. And then I'll add a few Cloud 9 Dream Drops by Nuvo just around the flower areas. So that is it. That is the card for today. Like I said, I will leave all of the information on the hop in the description box below, as well as all of the supplies that I used for this card. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.